So I'm now delighted to be able to introduce to you our second speaker this morning. Professor Elizabeth Williams is a postdoctoral fellow at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University, and her research focuses on agricultural developments in Bilad al-Sham from the late Ottoman period through the French Mandate. The title of her paper today is on the screen in front of you, and is representing the Rural, the International Institute of Agriculture and the Politics of Ottoman Statistics collection. Please welcome Elizabeth Williams.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you to Martha and the organizers of this conference for having me here. It's really really a pleasure to work on this presentation. Is that better? Okay. So, in 1905, representatives from countries around the world gathered in Rome for the founding of the International Institute of Agriculture, or the IIA, as I'll call it. The institute, which would evolve into the precursor of the Food and Agricultural Organization, the FAO, of the United Nations, had as primary goals the collection, standardization, and distribution of annual agricultural statistics from governments around the globe. The centralization of information about agricultural production represented an attempt to calculate and make visible knowledge from multiple different sources and methods into a compilation that would be legible and consumable on an international level and across global space. The Ottoman Empire was a founding member of the IIA, and its officials' participation would have local repercussions as they worked to gather these statistics in a process that involved centralizing and representing this knowledge in various forms at the imperial level as well as the local. At the imperial level as well as the global. In what follows, I trace the ways in which this data collection legitimated certain sources of agricultural information over others and specific methods of collecting it. Codifying and quantifying agricultural production was a means, on the one hand, of demonstrating and asserting that agriculture was a calculable science and provided a basis for encouraging and justifying government support for more elaborate agricultural infrastructure. But it was also a process whereby the government could exercise more centralized control over knowledge of the empire's rural communities and their relative productive capacities. At the international level, it also meant participating in technocratic circles of agricultural expertise, again, in quotes, whose capacity to enforce these calculations served to demonstrate their control over the reproduction and distribution of this knowledge and a new set of economic stakes. The International Institute of Agriculture was the brainchild of an American by the name of David Lubin. In 1905, he successfully pitched to the King of Italy the idea of establishing an international venue in which governments could exchange information about matters such as the salaries of rural labor, plant diseases and possible treatments, questions related to rural credit, insurance, and cooperatives, and, according to the IIA's convention, quote, present measures for the protection of the common interests of farmers and the improvement of their conditions. However, end quote. However, the most pressing and important work of the IIA, according to Lubin, which would best enable it to address the issue of farmer well-being, to refer to some of the discussion yesterday, was the collection, standardization, and dissemination of annual statistics on crop production from around the globe. He considered this an essential step in maintaining some kind of stability in global market prices, while supposedly giving farmers a bird's eye view of the global market and thus a better sense of when to sell their crops. Such an optimistic conception of the role of statistics raises a number of questions about access and the capacity of farmers to have a choice in when they sell, given that this decision may be determined first and foremost by a number of other factors. Notably, these statistics were to be collected and furnished by the different participating governments, as opposed to various private agencies that had until then been the primary source of such figures for farmers and even some governments. The Institute's organizers and members tended to portray such agencies as unreliable, purveying information based on, quote, hearsay, and working with ulterior motives. In contrast, the logic went, government collection and control would be authoritative and could ensure accuracy. The immediate dilemma facing the Institute, however, was arriving at a way to standardize statistics from multiple governments given its diverse global membership. The governments involved included China, Japan, Persia, the Ottoman Empire, Egypt, the United States, and a number of countries from Europe and South America. And here, I hope you can see that okay. We actually had this as a list of all the participants in the initial meeting in 1905, as well as the seating chart for them. So you can see sort of how they were arranged. One of the main obstacles they faced was finding a way that all governments could agree on as a legitimate measure, for them at least, of predicting agriculture production before the harvest so that farmers and governments could know what to expect. Given the variety of factors that could damage crop intakes even just weeks or days before the harvest, determining the standard for this measurement proved a contentious issue. But even once a standard measure was agreed upon, there remained the issue of how each government would organize the collection of these statistics to be sent to the Institute. Most of these states had their own means of statistics collection, while some reportedly had none at all, or were organizing a service that could provide them to the Institute. Another group of countries that had never published statistics before on their crops decided to adopt the Institute's system, while others decided to keep their own means of statistics collection, but transpose them to suit the Institute's standards. A final group, composed of Germany, Austria, Belgium, Canada, the Ottoman Empire, and Italy, decided to alter their statistics collection to bring it into line with the Institute's requirements. Interestingly, questions about the capacity of the Ottoman Empire and the Balkan states of Serbia, Bulgaria, and Romania to provide the requisite statistics prompted Lubin and a delegate from Argentina to visit them in 1909 and speak with the responsible ministers in each country. In response, some of these ministers expressed their own concerns about the Institute's purpose and effectiveness, complaining about its slowness in delivering the information it promised. Nonetheless, each country's ministers, including the Ottoman Empire's Grand Vizier, assured the visitors they could provide the Institute with the requested information and that they had the capacity to collect it, an assurance which appears to have convinced Lubin, but led him to propose stronger follow-up measures. Despite these qualms, a closer look at activities on the ground in the Ottoman Empire demonstrates the links being undertaken to collect and compile agricultural statistics for local and global consumption. The initial Ottoman delegation to the Institute consisted of Mustafa Rashid Bey, the Ottoman ambassador to Italy, Jamil Bey, a member of the Technical Commission of the Empire's Ministry of Agriculture, and Hussein Effendi, a professor at the Agricultural School in Hudavendigar province. Following the Institute's founding, the participation of Ottoman officials in the Institute would serve not only as a link to a global community of like-minded technocrats, but would also find expression on the imperial and local levels as discussions from this international forum found expression in various Ottoman publications and projects. These took a number of forms. In 1907, the Ottoman Agriculture and Commerce Journal published an article about one of the Institute's latest meetings that included summaries of comments that were considered useful or of interest to the journal's readership. The article emphasized the need to increase the prestige of agriculture, suggesting that disproportionate investments had been made in industry, neglecting farmers and causing the, quote, masters of agriculture to leave their land and move to cities. This problem, the article argued, could be solved by increasing the esteem in which agriculture was held through more investment in efforts to convey to farmers the knowledge of new inventions and science. Agriculture and its contributions to the Ottoman economy, they contended, had been neglected. Official compilations of statistics, bound, published, and disseminated, represented a means of making this production visible, not to mention calculable and comparable across provinces. In an effort to contribute to the projects of the IIA, and as part of an internal imperial statistics compilation project, the Ottoman Interior Ministry in the summer of 1906, a year after the Institute's founding, sent out a request to the provinces asking for each local provincial government to send with haste the kinds of information requested by the Institute. An initial compilation of statistics for Ottoman Europe, covering the year 1323 or 1907 to 8, was quickly followed by another book published by the Forest, Mines, and Agriculture Ministry's Statistics Branch, which covered the year of 1909-1910 for Ottoman Asia and Africa. So there were all these distinctions made between crop production in Ottoman Asia versus Africa versus Europe, and often in the IIA's reports, these are reported as separate units. These compilations' introductions emphasized the statistics' authoritative nature and expressed confidence that the classification, organization, and compiling of the figures presented could be relied upon, even though they acknowledged there had been some criticisms of the process. Unfortunately, they do not go into the details of this. The collection of statistics for Ottoman Asia and Africa prefaced its volume on agricultural production with population statistics for each province. These included details on the number of households involved in farming, the range of dunhams farmed by these households, and the average amount of dunhams planted in grain for each household. These were then followed by statistics detailing production numbers for grains, legumes and potatoes, industrial and oil-producing plants, animals, and animal products. The figures presented underline the degree of input as well as output involved in the production process. And this is I have a couple of pages here that shows you sort of how the layout is. This is for the grain section of the statistics collection, and this one is from Beirut, and then we also have Aleppo. So you see, you have to the side the different causes laid out, and then you have like wheat, barley, the different grains across the top, and then the production levels. So the categories going on here. So for example, grain production included figures not only on the amount harvested, but also the amount of seed sown. So this idea of you're having a certain amount of input, and so that that has to count into your figures for output. The editors also noted that while they included statistics on the areas of land cultivated in annual crops and vineyards, they were unable to include areas for olive groves, mulberries, gardens, orchards, and meadows. And thus the cultivated land covered in the statistics was only a part of the total area under cultivation. These volumes were followed by several others. Using essentially the same format, in 1916, the Commerce and Agriculture Ministry's Statistics Office published a fresh compilation of agricultural statistics that covered the years of 1913 to 1914. In addition to the original stats covered in the first volumes, this volume included details on the agricultural institutions that had been established throughout the empire. For Blad Hashem, these included an agricultural school in Selimiya, now in Syria, a farm school and dairy school in Aleppo, and a silk school in Beirut. The compilers also noted that they could not include statistics on vegetable gardens, meadows, fertilizers and agricultural tools, methods used, diseases and pests, despite the, quote, economic importance of these factors. In 1917, the ministry issued another compilation. This time it consisted of industrial statistics for 1913 and 15. And finally, a volume of forest statistics was also produced that covered the years 1909 to 1910. So you have a number of different books coming out. Now, these books, some of them were quite large, and if the weight of a 750-page book, the length of the 1913-14 compilation might have been a bit burdensome for some. In 1913-1914, the ministry made a visual representation of the statistics, printing a map of the empire's provincial divisions surrounded by a variety of bar charts to visually represent in a succinct, colorful display key statistics on production for each province. It's a bit hard to read, but you have statistics on the amount of grain planted in each province. You have statistics on the amount of oil-producing crops. So the same sorts of categories that we see in the books themselves are here sort of represented in this very sort of neatly put together chart. It is unclear just how widely distributed these compilations and charts were, but the information was most likely intended for a small group of elite technocrats, large landowners, and government bureaucrats. Codifying and quantifying of agricultural production entailed by these projects were a means, on the one hand, of demonstrating and asserting its scientific and calculable nature. Those in favor of more government support for scientific, quote, scientific agriculture, it was often talked about as a distinct thing from sort of the old ways of doing agriculture, despite the fact that it was far more complicated than that, but I can't get into that now. Anyway, those in favor of more government support for scientific agriculture projects no doubt hoped this representation would encourage this support. On the other hand, the project provided a means whereby government officials could easily access a centralized representation of knowledge regarding the empire's agricultural production, even in the midst of World War I. Now, following World War I, with the onset of the French mandate in the region that would become the nation states eventually of Syria and Lebanon, the area's relationship with the IIA would change. The question arose of whether France could register Syria and Greater Lebanon with its mandate status as a participant in the IIA. The mandate would, quote, naturally, mandate officials argued, be represented by a French official and would essentially give France 4 additional votes in the Institute. Mandate officials seemed more interested in the relative comparative political influence it would give them vote-wise in the Institute vis-a-vis countries like England, who had a number of votes from its colonies, and Italy, than in any access to statistics or statistical representations of Syria that it might facilitate. However, after years of back and forth about the cost involved and the fact that the adherence of the mandate states would offer, quote, no real advantage, by 1929, the High Commissioner decided to forego all representation of the mandate states at the Institute. And when I've looked at the Institute's records, I can't, it's like Syria and Lebanon disappear. They're not there anymore. Nonetheless, the local technocrats continue to draw on its statistics for understanding Syria's relative agricultural plight post-World War I. Mustafa al-Shahabi, the director of state lands, cited statistics from the International Institute of Agriculture in his discussion of how the war had encouraged the expansion of cultivated areas in countries like Argentina, Australia, Canada, and the United States, leading to overproduction and stockpiling that post-war had driven down seed prices. Based on this situation, he argued that the government had a responsibility to intervene in order to prevent local markets from being glutted with the overproduction. He cited French policies in the metropole as exemplary in this last regard, noting that it increased customs when the French harvest was good and reduced them when it was lacking. Syria, he insisted, should do the same. Thus we see how even as Syria and Lebanon came to lack a presence in the sphere of international statistics gathering, the work of the Institute continued to be consumed by the region's technocrats in support of arguments for trade and agricultural policies. Tracing the productive interactions of officials from the Ottoman Empire and even the French Mandate era with the International Institute of Agriculture foregrounds a number of key dynamics in the history of statistics production. On the one hand, we see the multiple levels of centralization and standardization, both within the empire and on the international level. We also see the privileging of a certain form of knowledge, namely state-produced knowledge, as authoritative and accurate over a multiplicity of other forms of knowledge that might actually have come from sources closer to the local. Finally, it demonstrates a connection between the production of the calculations and the conception of agricultural production as an increasingly, quote, scientific process that could be measured and represented even in an impressive tome of 750 pages. This history also suggests how the measurements that have made visible certain aspects of rural life have changed over time. There are no statistics in these early compilations that measure indices of rural well-being aside from the figures of production and what that could tell officials about whether an area had had a relatively good harvest versus a bad one. These figures could indeed suggest whether farmers in the region might be struggling. But interestingly, these early statistics were rhetorically justified as a way to provide knowledge to the farmer so that the farmer would have a better chance at securing his or her own well-being. Of course, such a justification raises all kinds of questions about access and the multiple other obligations that could easily make such figures irrelevant in the farmer's decision as to when to sell. As the internationally centralized and disseminated statistical compilation started by the International Institute of Agriculture continues apace under the auspices of the FAO, this history suggests the change over time that has shaped the production of certain forms of bounded, calculated knowledge on rural areas, privileging certain kinds of visibility and obscuring others. Thanks. Okay. Here, it's really really a pleasure to work on this presentation. Is that better? Okay. So, in 1905, representatives from countries around the world gathered in Rome for the founding of the International Institute of Agriculture, or the IIA, as I'll call it. The institute, which would evolve into the precursor of the Food and Agricultural Organization, the FAO, of the United Nations, had
today is on the screen in front of you and is representing the rural, the International Institute of Agriculture and the Politics of Ottoman Statistics collection. Please welcome Elizabeth Williams.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you to Martha and the organizers of this conference for having me work to gather these statistics in a process that involves centralizing and representing this knowledge in various forms at the imperial level as well as the local. In what follows, at the imperial level as well as the global. In what follows, I trace the ways in which this data collection legitimated certain sources of agricultural information over others and specific methods of collecting it. Codifying and quantifying agricultural production was a means, on the one hand, of demonstrating and asserting that agriculture was a primary goals, the collection, standardization, and distribution of annual agricultural statistics from governments around the globe. The centralization of information about agricultural production represented an attempt to calculate and make visible knowledge from multiple different sources and methods into a compilation that would be legible and consumable on an international level and across global space. The Ottoman Empire was a founding member of the IIA, and its officials' participation would have local repercussions as they
So I'm now delighted to be able to introduce to you our second speaker this morning. Professor Elizabeth Williams is a postdoctoral fellow at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University, and her research focuses on agricultural developments in Bilad al-Sham from the late Ottoman period through the French Mandate. The title of her paper